Before we begin the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us where you watched it in the comments. Elias Ward had lived alone for so many years that silence had become the only sound he trusted. His cabin sat miles beyond the nearest settlement, surrounded by dry grass, wind-worn rocks, and a river that cut through the land like an old boundary line. He was a ranch hand in his younger days, a steady worker with a wife and a small son. Both were killed in a raid that tore his life apart. Since then, Elias had no real mission except to keep breathing, keep the land alive, and stay out of reach of people who brought noise or trouble. He spent his days repairing old fences, tending 2 horses, and collecting supplies on rare trips into town. He avoided conversation, avoided company, and avoided anything that reminded him of the life he lost. Most nights passed the same way, cooking beans by the fire, sharpening tools, sitting on the porch until the stars came out, until the cold evening when everything changed. The sun was dropping behind the hills, leaving the sky a plain, colorless gray. Elias was heading to the river with an empty bucket, thinking about the weather and the weak roof beam he planned to fix the next morning. As he approached the water, he stopped. A shape was slumped near the riverbank, small, curled in on itself, barely moving. His first reaction was tension in his chest. People out here rarely meant anything good. He had learned long ago that getting involved usually ended badly. But when he stepped closer, he saw a young woman, mud on her clothes, scratches along her arms, her breath unsteady. The fear in her posture hit him harder than the cold wind. Elias crouched a few feet away. "You hurt?" he asked, keeping his voice low. The woman lifted her head just enough for him to see her eyes, wide, unfocused, full of panic. She didn't answer. She looked like she expected him to strike her or drag her somewhere she didn't want to go. Elias recognized that look. He had worn it once himself. He made a quick decision. Leaving her, there wasn't an option he could live with. "I'm going to get you on your feet," he said. "Not going to harm you." She still didn't speak, but she didn't resist when he slid one arm under her shoulders and lifted. She was lighter than he expected, trembling with cold. Her clothes were torn. The side of her face was bruised. On the walk back to the cabin, she kept her eyes on the ground, watching every step as if expecting danger to jump out from behind the trees. Elias could feel her nerves through the way she tightened or loosened her grip on his sleeve. She wasn't just scared. She was expecting someone to come after her. Inside the cabin, he guided her to the bed near the stove. "Sit," he said gently. She hesitated, as if unsure whether to trust him. Elias stepped back, so she could see he wasn't trying to corner her. Slowly, she lowered herself onto the mattress. He lit a lantern, stoked a fire, and warmed water. When he handed her a cup, her hands shook too much to lift it. Elias held it steady for her while she drank in small, careful sips. After a few minutes, her breathing calmed. The tension in her shoulders eased slightly. "What happened?" he asked, not out of curiosity, but because he needed to know if danger was coming toward his land. Her eyes flicked toward the door and then down at her hands. "I can't talk about it," she whispered. Elias studied her face, fear, shame, exhaustion. He understood when someone couldn't give answers. He had been that person once. "All right," he said. "You don't have to. Just rest." For the first time, she looked at him directly. He could tell she was trying to decide if he was safe. He didn't move, letting her see the truth. An old man with tired eyes, scars on his knuckles, someone who wasn't looking to take anything from her. She finally said, "My name is Meera." He nodded. "Elias Ward." Meera scanned the cabin, the sturdy walls, the tools hung in clean rows, the rifle leaned carefully in the corner. Her breathing slowed as she realized she had not been brought somewhere dangerous. Still, she held herself tight, ready to run if she needed to. Elias stepped aside to give her space and settled on a chair near the table. "You're safe here tonight," he said. "That's enough for now." The wind pressed against the old boards outside, but the fire kept the room warm. Meera pulled the blanket around herself and closed her eyes with the kind of exhaustion that came after too much running. Elias watched her for a moment, not out of discomfort, but out of responsibility. He needed to know she was truly all right. He wasn't sure why he cared. Maybe because she reminded him of people he couldn't save. Maybe because living alone for so long had hardened him more than he realized, and this moment softened something he thought was gone forever. When her breathing steadied and she finally drifted off, Elias looked toward the river through the small cabin window. He didn't know who she was running from. He didn't know what trouble might be following her trail. But he knew she hadn't ended up on his land by accident. And for the first time in years, he felt a familiar sense of purpose, protecting someone who had nowhere else to go. His quiet life was no longer quiet, and deep down, he knew it wasn't going back to the way it was. The night passed without interruption, though Elias barely slept. He stayed in his chair, boots still on, listening to the fire crackle and to every small sound outside. Meera slept deeply once exhaustion took her over. But even in sleep, she twitched at sudden pops from the wood or the shift of the wind across the roof. Elias watched her carefully, not out of suspicion, but out of responsibility. She looked like someone who had not known safety for a long time. By dawn, the worst of her shivering had eased. The bruises on her cheeks showed clearer in the morning light, raised and dark, and the cuts along her arms had dried into thin, stiff lines. Elias noticed she hadn't eaten enough the night before. That mattered. People who were starving lost their ability to think straight, and he needed her grounded enough to make sense of what danger she carried with her. He heated water on the stove, made coffee for himself, and a warm broth for her. When she woke, she stared at the ceiling for a moment, as if unsure where she was. Then her eyes moved to Elias, who sat at the small table, hands wrapped around his tin cup. "It's morning," he said quietly. "You're safe." She pushed herself upright with slow movements. Elias saw a mixture of relief and caution in her expression. She still wasn't sure of him. Not completely, but she wasn't terrified anymore. He offered the bowl. "Drink this first. It'll help." Meera hesitated, then took it. The warmth steadied her. After a few sips, some color returned to her face. Elias decided to address the questions he'd left unsaid the night before. Not the details of what happened. He told her she didn't have to speak about that, but the practical things. He needed to know if someone would come looking. Not knowing could get them both hurt. "How long were you out there before I found you?" he asked. Meera lowered the bowl. "Since yesterday morning," she said, voice raspy from hours of cold air. "I crossed the river upstream and followed it. I didn't stop until I couldn't run anymore." "That's a full day of moving," Elias said, studying her condition. "You shouldn't have been able to stay on your feet that long unless you were running from something bad." She didn't flinch this time. She simply nodded. Elias continued with what mattered most. "Are they still searching for you?" "Yes," she said. "They'll search until they find me." Her voice didn't tremble. That told Elias something important. Meera wasn't weak. She'd been cornered, but she hadn't broken. She was someone who survived through determination, not luck. Elias leaned back slightly, considering her answer. "You can stay here until we figure out what to do," he said. "But I need to know how many men there are." She swallowed. "3, maybe 4 now. They're from the settlement past the ridge." "Why are they after you?" Meera looked down at her hands. "I didn't belong to them. They thought they could make me stay anyway." Elias felt a slow, familiar anger rising in him. Not the sharp anger of youth, but the steady, controlled anger of a man who had seen cruelty before. The kind of anger that didn't burn out quickly. He didn't push her for more. What she shared was enough to understand the danger. She set the bowl aside. "Why did you help me?" she asked suddenly. "You didn't know who I was." Elias rubbed the back of his hand over his jaw. It was a fair question, one she deserved an honest answer to. "I've seen people hurt for no reason," he said. "I'm not letting it happen on my land. That's all." Meera studied him for a long moment. She was trying to judge him, not as a threat, but as someone she might be able to trust. She wasn't used to kindness without a cost. Elias saw that clearly now. He stood and moved to the stove, giving her space. "You should rest more," he said. "Your legs are shaking." "I can stand," she insisted, though her hands gripped the edge of the bed. "You don't need to yet." Elias kept his tone calm, but firm. He didn't want her collapsing the second she tried to move. Meera hesitated, then relaxed her grip. For the first time since waking, she allowed her body to show the exhaustion she'd been holding back. The cabin settled into its quiet rhythm. Elias worked on simple tasks, checking the window frames, adjusting the stove, tightening a loose hinge on the door, but he didn't move far from her. Meera watched him with careful attention, trying to understand the man she'd ended up with. "What about you?" she finally asked. "Why live out here alone?" Elias paused. He didn't like talking about his past, but she had trusted him with her fear. He owed her something in return. "I lost my family," he said plainly. "A long time ago. After that, I stayed away from towns. From people. This place is quiet. It's easier." Myra's expression softened. She didn't push him for details. She simply understood. They stayed in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Elias thought about the men who might come searching for her, how soon they could arrive, how prepared he needed to be. Meera, meanwhile, seemed to be gathering her strength and her courage. She was scared, but she wasn't broken. Eventually she asked, "If they come here, what will you do?" Elias answered without hesitation, "I'll keep you safe." There was no pride in his voice, no promise he couldn't keep, just a steady certainty that came from years of surviving the worst the world had to offer. Meera took a slow breath, letting his words settle into her mind. For the first time since arriving in his cabin, she looked less like a hunted stranger and more like someone who believed she had a chance. Outside, the morning wind brushed against the walls, but inside the cabin, a fragile sense of safety began to form. Quiet, small, and entirely real. Elias watched her settle back onto the bed, and he understood something clearly. Whatever happened next, he was no longer facing it alone. The morning stretched into a slow, quiet afternoon. Meera dozed on and off while Elias worked around the cabin, never straying far, keeping an ear out for anything unusual. The calm helped her settle, but the tension never fully left her posture. Each time the wind pushed against the boards or a horse snorted from the small corral outside, she startled slightly before forcing herself to breathe. Elias noticed every reaction. It confirmed what he already suspected. This wasn't the kind of fear that grew overnight. It was the kind that came from long-term danger, from being cornered for so long that even small sounds felt like warnings. He decided she needed routine, something simple to ground her. "You feel steady enough to sit at the table?" he asked. Meera tested her legs before answering. "I think so." He nodded and helped her over without making a show of it. She walked slowly, each step measured, but she didn't collapse. That was progress. As she sat, she looked around the cabin with sharper awareness than she had the day before. She noticed Elias' tools arranged in careful rows, the patched roof beam over the bed, and the small wooden box near the stove that held dried herbs and leftover supplies. She also noticed something she hadn't registered before, a small photograph on the shelf. The edges were worn, and the image had faded, but she could make out a woman holding a child. Elias saw her staring. For a moment, he considered walking over and putting the photograph away, but he didn't. Hiding it wouldn't change anything. "My wife and son," he said simply. "Long gone now." Meera lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry." "Nothing to be sorry for," Elias said. Life went the way it went. He didn't elaborate, and Meera didn't ask. But she now understood why Elias lived so far from town, why he kept to himself, and why he carried sadness in his quiet moments. It wasn't mystery, it was loss. Elias set bread and stew on the table. Meera ate slowly, trying not to appear starved even though she clearly was. Elias didn't comment on her speed. He remembered what it felt like to go without food and didn't want her to feel ashamed. Between bites, Meera asked, "How far is the settlement I came from?" 2 days on foot," Elias answered. "Less on horseback." A shadow crossed her face. "Then they might reach this valley soon." "They might," Elias agreed calmly. "But they don't know this land. You do a little. That puts us ahead." That reassurance wasn't dramatic or comforting in a soft way. It was straightforward, grounded, the kind of certainty that Meera needed to hear. She relaxed a fraction. After the meal, Elias stepped outside to check the perimeter. He didn't like leaving her alone even briefly, but he needed to see if any tracks had come too close. Meera watched him through the window. He moved with the slow, deliberate steps of a man who understood danger without needing to define it. She was beginning to trust his judgment more than her own. When Elias returned, he carried firewood under one arm and a set of iron spikes under the other. "Storm damaged part of the door frame last week," he explained. "I'm reinforcing it." He set the supplies down and bent to lift a heavy beam. It was awkward and required strength he no longer had easily. Meera watched him strain and instinctively moved to help. "That looks heavy," she said. "It is," Elias grunted, shifting his grip. "You're too old for this," she said before she could stop herself. Elias paused. It wasn't anger that crossed his face, just surprise, then a short, dry exhale that almost resembled a laugh. Meera froze, worried she had offended him, but he shook his head. "Maybe so," he said, "but it still needs doing." He adjusted his stance and lifted again. Meera reached for the other end of the beam. "I can help," she insisted. Elias examined her, thin, bruised, still shaky. "You sure? I won't break," she muttered. He hesitated, then nodded. Together they lifted the beam, moving slowly but steadily. Meera winced once, but didn't complain. Elias watched her carefully, prepared to take the full weight if she faltered, but she stayed upright. When they set the beam down, Meera leaned against the table to catch her breath. Elias wiped his palms on his trousers and gave a small nod of approval. "You've got more strength than you look," he said. She tried not to show how much that meant to her, but it was clear she wasn't used to being spoken to with respect. As Elias hammered the spikes into place, Meera sat near the stove, watching him work. She realized she had asked almost nothing about him, while he had asked only what was necessary about her. There had been no interrogation, no pressure, no assumptions. Just simple, steady acceptance. "Elias," she said after a moment, "are you sure you want me here? I could bring trouble." "You didn't bring trouble," he said firmly. "Trouble was already following you. That's different, but it's your land, your home." "I've lived alone so long I forgot what a home feels like," he answered. "Right now it feels like having another voice in the room. That's not a bad thing." Meera looked down, trying to hide the emotion those words stirred in her. She had spent so long running, so long expecting to be unwanted or pushed away, that the simple act of being accepted without condition felt overwhelming. Outside, the wind brushed across the grass, steady and cold. Inside, the cabin grew warmer, not just from the fire but from the shift in the room's atmosphere. Meera no longer felt like a stranger waiting to be turned away. Elias no longer felt like a man guarding his solitude. The walls between them didn't crumble all at once, but a crack had opened, small, real, and enough to let something human pass through. For the first time since arriving, Meera allowed herself a quiet, careful breath that wasn't filled with fear. Elias didn't say anything, but he felt it too, the beginning of something he hadn't felt in years. Connection, however fragile. Neither of them knew how long the calm would last, but for now the cabin held a sense of safety they both needed more than they wanted to admit. By early evening, the air grew colder, and the sky settled into a dull, heavy shade. Elias stepped out to check the horses while Meera rested at the table. But when he returned, his expression had changed. It was subtle, just a slight tightening around his mouth, a shift in the way he carried his shoulders, but Meera noticed immediately. "What is it?" she asked, pushing herself upright. Elias brushed the dirt off his gloves. "Tracks fresh ones. Not mine, not the horses. Too heavy to be a deer." After a pause, he added, "Someone was on foot, moving through the trees behind the corral." Meera swallowed hard. "How close?" "Closer than I like." The question that had been hanging in the back of her mind since yesterday suddenly felt urgent. Had they already found her trail? Were they watching? Waiting? Elias sensed her panic before she even spoke. He set a hand on the table, steady but not imposing. "Don't jump ahead. One track doesn't mean they're here. It means we stay alert." His calm voice grounded her enough to breathe again, but the fear didn't leave her eyes. Elias continued, "But I need the truth now. All of it. If they know your scent, your name, where you might run, anything." Meera clenched her jaw. For a long moment, she fought against the instinct to stay silent. She had held onto her secrets so tightly that letting any of them out felt dangerous. But Elias' eyes weren't demanding. They were steady, patient, and honest in a way she recognized as rare. They wanted to keep me, she finally said. The men from the settlement. I didn't belong to them, but they acted like I did. Elias said nothing, letting her continue at her own pace. One of them, Rogan, decided I should stay. I told him no. He didn't like being told no. Her hands tightened around the edge of her seat. He wasn't the kind of man who let things go. When I tried to leave, he sent the others after me. Elias absorbed this quietly. The details were simple, but they told him everything he needed to know about the kind of men they were dealing with: controlling, territorial, and proud enough to chase someone across 2 days of rough land. Rogan won't stop, Meera added. Not until he gets what he thinks he's owed. Elias exhaled through his nose. He had seen this kind of man before. Men who treated women like property. Men who thought force made them powerful. Elias had buried too many memories tied to men like that. He stood and checked a rifle by the door. Meera watched him, and her fear shifted into something else: concern. Should you be standing up to them alone? She asked quietly. I'm not alone, Elias said. You're here. That changes things. Meera didn't respond, but the words settled deep inside her. No one had ever implied she mattered in a way that affected decisions. She wasn't used to being considered. She wasn't used to being defended. Elias moved around the cabin, lowering the lantern lights, securing the windows, and checking the lock he had repaired earlier. Meera followed him with her eyes, seeing how he handled each task with the calm of someone who had prepared for danger before, someone who didn't panic even when the situation called for it. She asked another question that had been building inside her since she arrived. Why didn't you turn me away last night? You could have told me to keep moving. Elias paused at the window before answering. Because I know what it's like to run with no place to go. Meera waited, sensing there was more. My family, Elias began, voice low and steady. After they were killed, I wandered for months. I slept in barns, under wagons, anywhere that kept the rain off me. People didn't want trouble, so they didn't want me. I remember what it felt like to stand in a doorway and hope someone would give me 5 minutes of safety. Myra's throat tightened. His past was different from hers, but the feeling he described was the same: being lost, being unwanted, being seen as a burden instead of a person. You're not trouble to me, Elias said. Not the kind that matters. For the first time, Meera didn't drop her gaze. She held his, even though it made her chest tighten in an unfamiliar way. As darkness settled, Elias brought out a small oil lamp and placed it on the table. The warm glow softened the harsh edges of the cabin, wrapping the room in a quiet stillness. Meera finally asked the question she had avoided since arriving. Elias, if Rogan finds us, what will you do? Elias didn't hesitate. Whatever I have to. The answer wasn't dramatic, wasn't loud. It was simple, grounded, final. And it made Myra's breath catch, not out of fear, but out of the strange, cautious feeling of being protected without demand or condition. Later, while Elias stepped outside to secure the horses for the night, Meera sat by the fire, thinking about everything she had revealed and everything Elias had shared in return. The silence in the cabin no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like a place where she could rest without being judged. Through the window, she watched Elias move through the dim light with deliberate focus, scanning the tree line. He was older, his joints stiff, his movements slower than they once had been, but there was strength in the way he held himself, strength in the way he stood between her and the world outside. She realized something important. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He wasn't performing bravery. He was simply a man who refused to let cruelty into his home. When he returned, cold air clinging to his coat, he closed the door and took a seat opposite her. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The shadows outside were growing thicker, the danger closer, but inside the cabin, something steady was finally taking shape. Trust, fragile but real. For the first time in a long time, Meera didn't feel like she was waiting to be hunted. She felt like she was waiting with someone who wouldn't let her face the night alone. Night arrived fast and without warning. The last line of daylight disappeared behind the ridge, leaving the land wrapped in a cold, hollow darkness. Elias checked every shutter twice before lighting only a single lantern, keeping the cabin dim enough that anyone watching from the trees wouldn't see movement inside. Meera sat at the table, hands clasped tightly. Every sound from outside, the shift of the wind, the creak of a loose board, the distant cry of a night bird, made her shoulders jump. She tried to steady her breathing, but her body reacted on its own, shaped by weeks of running. Elias noticed. He moved quietly as he set the rifle within arm's reach. "Breathe slow," he said. "There's no danger inside this room." Meera nodded, though her heart still beat hard. She finally asked the question that had been growing in her mind. If Rogan brought more than 3 men, can we handle it? Elias didn't sugarcoat anything. If they come all at once, it'll get rough. But men like Rogan don't think straight. He wants you alive, not dead. That slows him down, gives us an edge. His honesty grounded her. Firm, realistic, not meant to comfort, but to prepare. As the wind picked up, a noise cracked through the night, a horse's distant snort. Meera froze. Elias stood silently, listening. A moment later, another faint sound followed, hooves shifting on dry earth. "Someone's out there," Meera whispered. Elias moved to the window but kept himself low. He didn't look out directly. Instead, he angled the lantern behind him and used the glass's glare to observe shadows outside. Meera watched him, realizing this wasn't the first time he'd prepared for danger. His movements were slow, controlled, formed by experience rather than fear. He finally spoke. "3 horses. They're keeping distance." Myra's stomach tightened. "It's them." "Likely," Elias said. "But they're not pressing in. They're watching." "Why?" she asked. "They're trying to figure out who lives here. Trying to see what they're walking into." Meera wrapped her arms around herself. "If they think it's just you, they won't back off." "Let them think what they want," Elias replied. "They don't know the land. They don't know me." His confidence wasn't reckless. It was grounded. Meera found herself relying on it more than she expected. Minutes passed. The hooves outside shifted again, this time closer. Elias lowered the lantern flame until the cabin fell into a darker, quieter glow. Myra's breath became shallow again. "Stay behind me if they push in," Elias said. "If they call your name, don't answer." Meera nodded, gripping the edge of the chair with trembling hands. The next sound came suddenly, a low, drawn-out whistle from the trees. Myra's eyes widened. "That's Rogan's signal," she whispered. Elias' expression hardened. "Then he's testing to see if you answer." "Don't." Silence followed. Heavy, waiting. Elias stepped forward, placing his body between Meera and the door. Meera could feel her heartbeat pounding through her chest, but Elias' presence gave her something solid to cling to. She watched the way he stood, feet grounded, shoulders steady, rifle balanced in his hands. He looked like the kind of man who had weathered worse storms than this and survived everyone. Outside, branches crackled. A man's voice called out, muffled but close. "Anyone home in there?" Elias didn't respond. Another voice spoke, sharp and patient. "We saw the tracks. Someone brought her this way." Elias shifted slightly, raising the rifle just enough to be ready. Myra's hands tightened on her knees. They were so close. She could almost see their silhouettes through the thin cracks of the old shutter. Then another voice, one she recognized immediately. "Meera." Rogan's voice cut through the night, loud and confident. "You can make this easy." Myra's body locked up, her breath catching. Elias sensed her panic without even turning his head. "Stay still," he murmured. Rogan called again. "Girl, you know what happens if you keep running. You belong with us. Come out and we can settle this." Myra's voice shook. "He won't leave unless." "He'll leave," Elias interrupted firmly. "Not tonight, maybe, but he will." He took a slow breath and stepped toward the door. Meera reached for him instinctively. "Elias, don't go out there." "I'm not," he said. "I'm just letting them know the cabin isn't abandoned." He knocked twice on the doorframe, loud, deliberate, controlled. It echoed through the quiet. Silence. Then the voice outside changed tone, no longer confident, now wary. "There's someone in there." Elias answered with a steady, grounded voice. "This land's mine. The girl stays where she is." Meera stared at him, shocked. Elias didn't raise his voice, didn't shout, didn't threaten. He just spoke the truth with a strength that made Rogan's boldness crack. Outside, The men whispered among themselves. Rogan finally called out, anger rising. "Old man, she's not your problem. You don't know what she did." Elias replied, "I know she doesn't want to go with you." "That's enough." Another long silence followed. Elias could imagine them looking at the cabin, evaluating whether the old structure and the older man were worth challenging head-on. Then the hooves shifted again. One rider started backing away. Rogan's voice came one last time. "We'll be back." Elias didn't respond. He waited until he could no longer hear the horses before lowering the rifle. Meera let out a shuddering breath she'd been holding too long. Her legs gave out, and she sank into the chair. Elias walked over and checked the latch again, then pulled the heavier lock bar into place. "They didn't break in," Meera said, voice shaking. "Why not?" "They weren't sure what they were up against," Elias answered. "They expected you alone. They didn't expect someone to stand with you." Meera pressed her hands over her face as her breathing steadied. "I thought they dragged me out. I thought." "They didn't," Elias said quietly. "And they won't. Not while you're here." She lowered her hands and looked at him. Her fear was still there, but something else had taken root beneath it. Trust. Not because he saved her life, not because he threatened the men outside, but because when the darkness pressed in and voices from her past called her name, Elias stood between her and the door without a second thought. He stepped away, giving her space to calm herself, but Meera kept watching him, realizing something important. She wasn't just hiding in this cabin anymore. She was being protected, and Elias wasn't doing it out of obligation. He had chosen to. The night passed without another sound from the ridge, but neither Elias nor Meera slept more than a few hours. The threat of returning riders wasn't something either of them could ignore. Still, the danger had shifted. The men hunting her now knew she wasn't alone. That changed the game. By sunrise, the cabin felt different. Not peaceful, but steadier. Elias made coffee and set a pan of cornbread near the fire while Meera washed her face in a metal basin, trying to clear the exhaustion from her eyes. The bruise along her cheek had darkened overnight, and her voice remained rough from fear and cold, but she walked with a bit more confidence than she had the day before. "They'll come back," Meera said quietly as she dried her hands on a cloth. "Rogan doesn't like being challenged." "I know," Elias replied, "but last night told us something important." She looked up. "What's that?" "They're not ready to die for his pride." They hesitated. Men like that break if they hit something solid enough. Meera wanted to believe him. Part of her already did. Another part still lived in the memories of the settlement, where Rogan's voice had meant danger, where no one stood between her and whatever he decided. She sat at the table with her coffee, warming her hands around the tin cup. What they try during the day. When there's no hiding. Elias sat across from her. Then we deal with it in daylight. Harder for them to sneak close. Easier for me to see what they're doing. Meera stared into her cup. "I don't understand you, Elias." "Why help me? I mean, really help me. You could have said a few words last night and handed me over. That would have been the end of it." Elias leaned back slightly, considering his answer. "You were running for your life. I've seen that look before. Too many times." He paused. "And because you didn't ask for anything except a chance to breathe. That tells me enough about you." Meera watched him with a mixture of confusion and gratitude. She had learned long ago that most people helped only when there was something to gain. Elias gained nothing by protecting her. Yet he did it anyway. She set the cup down. "I wasn't always running. I had a life before Rogan showed up." Elias nodded. "Tell me only what you want to tell." "He came to the settlement a year ago," she said. "Talked about building a bigger community, one with rules and order. People liked him at first. He was smooth, knew how to talk so folks listened. But when someone disagreed with him, he changed. He didn't like hearing no." She swallowed. "When I refused to help him with some work he demanded, he decided I needed to learn obedience." Elias' jaw tightened. "You don't owe obedience to men like him." "That's not how he saw it." Meera looked down at her hands. "So I left. I didn't wait for him to hurt me. I didn't give him the chance." Elias respected the strength it took to leave before things got worse. She hadn't run because she was weak. She had run because she knew her life depended on it. "Did you have anyone there who helped?" he asked. "A few women warned me to stay away from him. But no one stepped in when it mattered." She forced a breath. If he takes me back now, I won't get another chance. Elias held her gaze. He's not taking you back. There was no hesitation in his voice, no uncertainty. It wasn't a hopeful promise. It was a decision already made. Meera felt something shift inside her, fear loosening its grip just a little. As morning moved toward midday, Elias stepped outside to check the horses and the tree line. Meera insisted on going with him, even though he told her to rest. Stubbornness or pride, he wasn't sure which, pushed her to follow. I can't keep hiding behind walls, she said. If they come back, I want to be ready. Elias didn't argue this time. He showed her how to watch for movement between branches, how to read broken twigs, how dried grass bent differently if someone had walked through it recently. She listened with the focused attention of someone desperate to feel in control of her own life again. During their walk around the property, Meera asked a question she had avoided until now. What did you do when your family died? After the raid, Elias walked slowly, hands resting on his belt. For a while, I wanted to disappear. Then I wanted revenge. Then I realized neither one fixed anything. He looked toward the river. So I came here because I needed quiet. And quiet was the only thing I could live with. Meera stopped. Doesn't it get lonely? Sometimes, Elias said. But loneliness is easier than watching people you care about get hurt. She understood the meaning behind his words. She also understood that his decision to stand with her last night was not small or simple. It went against everything he'd forced himself to accept about being alone. They headed back to the cabin, and Meera felt something she hadn't felt in months, steady footing under her. Elias didn't shield her from the truth, but he didn't let her drown in it either. Inside, they shared another quiet meal. The fire popped in the stove, sending small sparks into the air. The atmosphere between them had changed. It wasn't just fear and survival anymore. It was connection, quiet, cautious, but unmistakably there. As evening settled again, Meera said softly, Elias, thank you for last night. I didn't do it for thanks, he replied. I did it because it was right. Still, she said, you didn't have to. Elias didn't respond at first. He looked in the fire, jaw firm, eyes tired but focused. Maybe I did, he said finally. Maybe I needed to. Meera didn't push for more. She didn't need to. In the quiet of the cabin, lit by fire, filled with slow breathing, strengthened by shared truths, the two of them settled into an understanding that neither of them spoke aloud. They were no longer strangers bound by circumstance. They were partners in survival, two wounded lives finding solid ground beside each other. And even though danger still sat somewhere out in the hills, the fear that had lived in both of them began to lose its strength, replaced by something sturdier. Trust. The next day brought a colder wind, the kind that scraped across the valley and made every sound sharper. Elias spent the early morning walking the perimeter again, checking for new tracks. Meera watched him from the cabin doorway, arms crossed against the chill. She no longer hid inside. Fear still lived under her skin, but she refused to let it control her. When Elias returned, he nodded toward the ridge. Tracks came closer during the night. Fresh ones. 3 riders, maybe 4. They're circling. Meera tensed. They're testing us again. Testing how close they can get before I step out, Elias said. Rogan is cautious, but his patience is thin. They'll want to finish this soon. Myra's heartbeat quickened. Then we should be ready. Elias looked at her carefully. Ready doesn't mean reckless. You stay inside unless they force you out. I'm not hiding behind you, she said quietly. I'm not asking you to, Elias replied. I'm asking you to survive. It was the first time he spoke plainly about the possibility of a confrontation. Meera heard the weight behind his words, the reality that the men hunting her wouldn't stop unless someone stopped them first. She stepped back into the cabin, gathering her thoughts. There was something she hadn't told Elias yet, something that mattered now that a fight was coming. When he entered after securing the horses, she spoke. Elias, Rogan doesn't want me just because I refused him. Elias paused. Then why? He's trying to build something in that settlement. A place where he gives orders and everyone obeys. He thought I made him look weak by leaving. If he lets me go, others might follow. That's why he wants me back. Elias absorbed the meaning immediately. So, this isn't about you as a person. It's about control. Meera nodded. Exactly. That's useful to know, Elias said. Men who chase control don't think clearly. They push too hard and trip over their own pride. It answered a question some listeners might wonder: why Rogan was so fixated, why he refused to stop, and why he brought others with him. It wasn't obsession. It was authority. The day wore on quietly, but tension built like a slow, tightening rope. The wind carried the smell of dust from the ridge, and Elias knew what that meant: riders kicking up loose earth. By late afternoon, Meera was sharpening a small kitchen blade, not a weapon meant for fighting, but something that gave her hands purpose. Elias loaded his rifle with calm precision. His movements were slow, careful, practiced. He wasn't a man preparing for glory. He was a man preparing because he had no choice. Meera glanced at him, seeing a different side of him than she had before. His age showed in the stiffness of his knees and the lines around his eyes, but his focus was sharp. He looked like the kind of man who had survived violence not by being fast, but by being steady. A sound broke the quiet. Hooves, unmistakably close this time. Elias went still. They're here. Meera moved to the window, peeking through a narrow gap. Four riders approached, just as Elias predicted. Rogan rode at the front, tall and rigid in the saddle, scanning the cabin with cold confidence. Two men flanked him. A fourth stayed farther back, watching the tree line. Rogan shouted, "Elias Ward, we're talking now, one way or another." Meera felt her throat tighten. Elias stepped beside her. "You stay behind me. If they rush the door, move to the back wall." "I won't run," she said. "I know," Elias replied. "But you'll move." "That's not running, it's positioning." He opened the door halfway and stepped into the open. Meera stayed in the shadowed interior, close enough to hear every word. Rogan smiled when he saw Elias. It wasn't friendly. "Old man, you're making this harder than it needs to be." Elias kept his rifle pointed down, but ready. "You rode onto my land last night. You circled this place like wolves. I'm finished being polite." Rogan's eyes narrowed. "We just want the girl. She's ours." "She's not," Elias said, "and she doesn't want to go." Rogan scoffed. "She doesn't know what she wants." At those words, Meera stepped forward into view. Not beside Elias, but just behind him, enough for Rogan to see her face. "I know exactly what I want," she said, voice steady. "And it's not you." Rogan's expression cracked, first with surprise, then anger. "You think he can protect you? He's old. One good shove, and he'll break." Elias' voice remained calm. "Try." Rogan signaled to the man on his right. The rider dismounted, emboldened by Rogan's authority. He took a step forward, scanning Elias, as if deciding how hard he needed to push to move past him. Before he could take another step, Elias raised his rifle. The movement was quick but not rushed. Firm, decisive, unmistakably final. "One more step," Elias said, "and you won't take a second." The rider froze. Rogan's jaw clenched. He hadn't expected this level of resistance. "You'd shoot a man over a girl who isn't even yours?" Rogan barked. Elias didn't break eye contact. "I'd shoot a man for trying to drag someone away who already said no." Meera felt heat rise in her chest. Fear mixing with something else, something she hadn't felt in years, being defended without being owned. Another rider shifted in the saddle. "Boss, maybe." Rogan cut him off with a raised hand. He looked between Elias and Meera, weighing the situation. Pride battled practicality behind his eyes. He wanted to make an example of her, but he also saw the truth. The old man wasn't bluffing. And a fight here, on land that wasn't his, could cost him more than he wanted to risk. Tension held the valley still for several long seconds. Finally, Rogan clicked his tongue. "Fine," he said. "You want her? Keep her." His words were bitter, but they were retreat. He turned his horse. The others hesitated and used to seeing their leader back down before following. Rogan called over his shoulder, "She ain't worth dying for." Elias replied evenly, "That's why you never should have chased her." Rogan didn't answer. He rode away, swallowed by the ridge, the other riders close behind. Silence fell. Elias let out a slow breath and lowered his rifle. Meera watched the tension drain from his shoulders, replaced by exhaustion he tried to hide. You stood up to them, she said quietly. I stood with you, Elias corrected. Meera stepped forward, closer to him than she had dared before. I don't know how to repay you. Elias looked at her, the hard lines in his face softening. You don't need to repay me. You needed help, so I helped. That's all. Meera shook her head. It's not all. No one has ever stood for me like that. Well, Elias said, they should have. He turned toward the cabin, but before he took a step, Meera placed a hand on his arm. Thank you, she whispered, voice trembling not from fear, but from relief. Elias nodded once, quietly. Let's go inside. There's still daylight and work to do. But Meera knew something had changed between them, within her, and in the hollow space she carried in her chest. For the first time in her life, someone had stood with her not out of duty or ownership, but out of choice. And standing there in the fading light, she knew she was no longer running alone. The rider's departure left the valley strangely quiet, as if the land itself were waiting to see what Elias and Meera would do next. Meera kept watching the ridge long after Rogan and his men vanished, half expecting them to return instantly with a different plan. But the silence held. The wind carried only the dry scent of pine and dust. Elias stepped back inside the cabin and set the rifle down, though he didn't move far from it. Meera followed, closing the door behind her. She realized how exhausted she was, her legs trembling, her hands shaking from the adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation. You should sit, Elias said. His voice had softened again, the sharp edge from the standoff fading. Meera sat on the edge of the bed, exhaling slowly. I didn't think he would leave, she admitted. I thought he'd fight. He wanted to, Elias replied, hanging his coat. But men like Rogan need an audience. When they're not sure they'll win, they change their tune. Meera looked up. You've dealt with men like him before, haven't you? Elias nodded. Too many. This answered a question the audience might have wondered earlier. How Elias remained so controlled, so confident. He had seen violence before. He knew how quickly situations could turn, and he knew how to stand firm without provoking worse trouble. The cabin slowly settled back in a normal rhythm, though the tension hadn't vanished entirely. Elias checked the windows, tightened the reinforced door, and ensured the horses were secured in the small corral. Meera watched him work with a kind of quiet reverence. He was older, yes, but his movements had purpose. His age didn't weaken him. It anchored him. When he returned, Meera was warming her hands near the stove. Elias pulled up a chair beside her. You held your ground, he said. That took more courage than you think. I was terrified, she admitted. Courage isn't the absence of fear, Elias said. It's doing what needs doing anyway. Meera gave a faint smile. I didn't know I had that in me. You did, Elias said simply. You always did. She let the words sink in. Being believed in was unfamiliar territory for her, and it stirred something fragile but steady inside her chest. They spent the rest of the afternoon repairing what needed tending. Elias replaced the cracked lock bar and adjusted the shutters to make them harder to pry open. Meera, wanting to contribute rather than sit idle, swept the cabin floor, cleaned the kitchen tools, and organized the supplies the best she could. At one point, she paused while reaching for a pan. Elias, if they come back in a few days, what then? Elias straightened from the window frame he was adjusting. They won't. How can you be sure? She asked. Because Rogan showed his men he couldn't force this, Elias explained. If he pushes again and fails, he loses control over them. He can't risk that. This explanation filled in a gap from earlier chapters. Why Rogan's authority mattered so much. Why he backed off the moment things turned uncertain. Meera absorbed this thoughtfully. So it's over? Elias looked at her for a long moment. Yes, it's over. The relief that washed over her was physical. Her shoulders loosened, the tightness in her chest eased, and her hands stopped shaking entirely for the first time in days. She sat down heavily on the chair near the table and covered her face, letting herself breathe. When she looked up again, Elias had set a cup of warm tea in front of her. Drink, he said. It'll help. She did. The warmth grounded her. She felt safe for the first time. Not just safe from Rogan, but safe from running safe from uncertainty, safe from the fear that had chased her across the valley. As evening settled, the cabin glowed with the soft warmth of the fire. Meera helped Elias prepare supper, cutting vegetables, stirring the pot, handing him what he needed. It wasn't about necessity. It was about sharing the same space without fear. At one point, Elias said quietly, "You don't have to stay here, you know. If you want to move on now that the danger's gone, I'll ride with you until you reach another town." Meera looked at him sharply. "Is that what you want?" Elias shook his head. "This is your life. Your choice. I won't decide it for you." Meera stared into the fire for a long time before answering. "I don't want to leave," she said at last. "I've never felt safe anywhere. Not really. Not until now." Elias didn't react immediately. He simply took in her words quietly, as if weighing their meaning carefully. "You're welcome here," he said finally, "for as long as you want." Her eyes softened at that. There was no expectation in his voice, no demand. He wasn't trying to make her stay. He was offering her a choice, something she'd never truly had. Later, as they finished supper, Meera stepped outside for fresh air. The valley was calm, moonlight settling over the land. Elias followed her to make sure she was all right. She leaned on the rail, looking out across the quiet fields. "This place feels different now," she said. "How so?" Elias asked. "It feels like home," she murmured. Elias looked at her profile, the tired strength in her posture, the peace slowly replacing fear in her eyes. "Then let's make it one," he said. Meera turned to him, a faint, genuine smile touching her lips, one that hadn't existed in the earlier chapters. "I'd like that." They stood together in the doorway of the cabin, the night no longer a threat but a calm, open space stretching around them. For the first time in a long time, both of them felt the same thing. A beginning, not an ending. The next morning arrived quietly, with a soft pale light spilling across the valley. No hoof prints disturbed the dirt, no shadows moved along the ridge, and no tension hung in the air. Meera stepped outside and breathed deeply, her breath leaving a faint mist in the cold dawn. This time, the silence didn't feel threatening. It felt settled, like the land had finally accepted the change that swept through it. Elias was already awake, splitting a small stack of firewood beside the cabin. His movements were slow but steady, the stiffness in his shoulders showing his age but not his weakness. Meera watched him for a moment before approaching. "You should rest your back," she said lightly. Elias set another log on the block. "I've been telling myself that for 20 years, he replied. "Never worked." Meera smiled, an easy, natural smile that hadn't existed days ago. "Still worth trying." He didn't argue, though he continued working. She stepped beside him and picked up a few pieces of split wood, stacking them neatly. It was a simple act, but Elias noticed the difference. She wasn't helping out of fear or desperation. She was helping because she wanted to be part of the place. "Sleep all right?" he asked. "Well enough," she said. "I woke a few times expecting something, but nothing came." "Nothing will," Elias replied. "Rogan's pride is bruised. He'll be busy fixing that instead of chasing shadows." This addressed one lingering question for the audience. Would Rogan return? Would danger remain? The answer was already visible in the valley's calm. That chapter of her life was over. Inside the cabin, they shared breakfast, cornbread and leftover stew warmed over the fire. The atmosphere felt lighter. Meera sat with her shoulders relaxed, Elias with a quiet calm that hadn't been present when she first arrived. After they finished eating, Meera set her spoon down and spoke with more certainty than she'd shown before. "There's something I need to ask," she said. "Now that the danger's gone, what would you want me to do?" Truly, Elias paused. He wasn't a man who knew how to give speeches. He didn't dress his feelings up in words. But she deserved honesty. "I want you safe," he said, "wherever that is." "That's not an answer," Meera replied gently. Elias looked at her across the table. "If you're asking what I prefer you stay. But not because you feel like you owe me. Not because you're scared to go. Only if you want this life." Myra's breath steadied. "I do," she said simply. "I want to stay." "Why?" Elias asked, not doubting her, but wanting her to hear her own reasoning. "Because for the first time," Meera said, "I'm not running. I'm not hiding. I'm not waiting for someone to decide my fate. Here, I can breathe. I can be myself. And you, she hesitated, choosing her words carefully. You see me as a person, not something to claim or control. That matters. Elias looked down for a moment, his jaw tightening with emotion he rarely lets surface. You're welcome here, he said quietly, for as long as you want. Meera reached across the table and touched his hand, hesitant at first, then sure. Elias didn't pull away. Later that day, they worked side by side repairing the corral fence, filling gaps in the cabin walls before winter set in, and organizing supplies. These were not chores of survival anymore. They were shared steps toward a future. Meera learned how to tie knots that would hold in strong winds. Elias taught her how to read weather shifts by watching the horizon. She offered ideas for improving the cabin storage, and he listened. Their partnership became natural, built on small actions rather than declarations. As evening approached, the sky filled with muted shades of orange and gray. They walked to the river, the place where Elias had first found her. Meera stood at the bank, watching the water move calmly. I don't recognize the person I was that night, she said softly. You were scared, Elias replied. But you were strong. You got yourself here. I didn't think I deserve a place like this, she admitted. Elias shook his head. Everyone deserves a place to rest. They stood quietly, listening to the river. Meera finally turned to him. What about you, Elias? What now? What does life look like for you? He took a long breath, his voice steady. I thought my life had already ended. I thought I'd just live out my days alone. But now, he looked at her with the same calm sincerity he had shown since the beginning. Now it looks different. Meera stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm glad I ended up here. So am I, he said. They walked back to the cabin together as the sun dipped behind the ridge. The door creaked the same way it always had. The fire crackled in the same stove, but everything inside felt new. Not because danger had passed, but because they had chosen each other, quietly, naturally, without asking for more than honesty and presence. That night, as they sat near the fire, Meera let her head rest lightly against Elias' shoulder. He didn't move, didn't hesitate. He simply accepted it. Outside, the valley held no threats. Inside, the cabin held the warm, steady promise of a shared future. There were no unanswered questions left, no fear of what tomorrow might bring. The story that began with running and fear ended with something fragile but real. Two people who had lost everything found a home, in the same place, at the same time, with each other.